Hello, this is Morale Bernard with the continuing story of Nirvana, meditation, knowledge, wisdom. Nirvana, meditation, knowledge, wisdom, the continuing story. And by the way, please subscribe to these videos and please share. Last words were that in this pointless cycle, he ran, growing tired, growing old, growing ill. Then the time came when a dream warned him. He had spent the hours of the evening with Kamala in her beautiful pleasure garden. They had been sitting under the trees, talking, and Kamala had said thoughtful words, words behind which a sadness and tiredness lay hidden. She had asked him to tell her about Gautama, and could not hear enough of him, how clear his eyes, how still and beautiful his mouth, how kind his smile, how peaceful his walk had been. For a long time, he had to tell her about the exalted Buddha. And Kamala had sighed and had said, "One day, perhaps soon, I'll also follow that Buddha. I'll give him my pleasure garden for a gift and take my refuge in his teachings." But after this, she had aroused him and had tied him to her in the act of making love with painful fervour, biting and in tears, as if once more she wanted to squeeze the last sweet drop out of his veins. Fleeting pleasure. Never before it had become so strangely clear to Siddhartha how closely lust was akin to death. Then he had lain by her side, and Kamala's face had been close to him, and under her eyes and next to the corners of her mouth he had, as clearly as never before, read a fearful inscription, an inscription of small lines, of slight grooves, an inscription reminiscent of autumn and old age, just as Siddhartha himself, who was only in his 40s, had already noticed, here and there, grey hairs among his black ones. Tiredness was written on Kamala's beautiful face. Tiredness from walking a long path, which has no happy destination. Tiredness in the beginning of withering, and concealed, still unsaid, perhaps not even conscious anxiety, fear of old age, fear of the autumn, fear of having to die. With a sigh, he had bid his farewell to her, the soul full of reluctance and full of concealed anxiety. Then Siddhartha had spent the night in his house with dancing girls and wine, and acted as if he was superior to them, the fellow members of his caste. Though this was no longer true, had drunk much wine and gone to bed a long time after midnight, been tired and yet excited, close to weeping and despair, and had for a long time sought to sleep in vain, his heart full of misery, which he thought he could not bear any longer, full of a disgust which he felt penetrating his entire body like the lukewarm, repulsive taste of the wine, the just too sweet, dull music, the just too soft smile of the dancing girls, the just too sweet scent of their hair and breast. But more than by anything else, he was disgusted by himself, by his perfumed hair, by the smell of wine from his mouth, by the flabby tiredness and listlessness of his skin, like when someone who has eaten and drunk far too much vomits it back up again with agonizing pain and is nevertheless glad about the relief. Thus this sleepless man wished to free himself of these pleasures, these habits, and all of this pointless life and himself in an immense burst of disgust. Not until the light of the morning and the beginning of the first activities on the street before his city house. He had slightly fallen asleep, had found, for a few moments, a half unconsciousness, a hint of sleep. In those moments, he had a dream. Kamala owned a small, rare singing bird in a golden cage. Of this bird he dreamt. He dreamt this bird had become mute, who at other times always used to sing in the morning, and since this aroused his attention, he stepped in front of the cage and looked inside. There the small bird was dead, and lay stiff on the ground. He took it out, weighed it for a moment in his hand, and then threw it away out in the street, and in the same moment he felt terribly shocked, and his heart hurt, as if he had thrown away from himself all value and everything good by throwing out this dead bird. Starting up from this dream, he felt encompassed by a deep sadness. Worthless, so it seemed to him, worthless and pointless was the way he had been going through life. Nothing which was alive, nothing which was in some way delicious or worth keeping he had left in his hands. Alone, he stood there, and empty like a castaway on the shore. With a gloomy mind, Siddhartha went to the pleasure garden he owned, locked the gate, sat down under a mango tree, felt death in his heart and horror in his chest, sat and sensed how everything died in him, withered in him, came to an end in him. By and by, he gathered his thoughts, and in his mind, he once again went the entire path of his life, starting with the first days he could remember. When there ever a time when he had experienced happiness, felt a true bliss? Oh yes, several times he had experienced such a thing. In his years as a boy, he had had a taste of it. When he had obtained praise from the Brahmins, he had felt it in his heart. There is a path in front of the one who has distinguished himself in the recitation of the holy verses, in the dispute with the learned ones, as an assistant in the offerings. Then he had felt it in his heart. There is a path in front of you are destined for. The gods are waiting you. And again, as a young man, when the ever-rising, upward fleeing goal of all thinking had ripped him out of and up from the multitude of those seeking the same goal, when he wrestled in pain for the purpose of Brahman, when every obtained knowledge only kindled new thirst in him, then again he had, in the midst of the thirst, in the midst of the pain, felt this very same thing. Go on, you are called upon. He had heard this voice when he had left his home and had chosen the life of a samana. And again when he had gone away from the samanas to that perfected one, and also when he had gone away from him to the uncertain. For how long had he not heard this voice any more? For how long had he reached no height any more? How even and dull was the manner in which his path had passed through life for many long years, without a high goal, without thirst, without elevation, content with small lustful pleasures, and yet never satisfied. For all of these many years, without knowing it himself, he had tried hard and longed to become a man like those many, like those children. And in all this, his life had been much more miserable and poorer than theirs, and their goals were not his, nor their worries. After all, that entire world of Kwamaswami people had only been a game to him, a dance he would watch, a comedy. Only Kamala had been dear, had been valuable to him. But was she still thus? Did he still need her, or she him? Did they not play a game without an ending? Was it necessary to live for this? No, it was not necessary. The name of this game was Sansara, a game for children, a game which was perhaps enjoyable to play once, twice, 10 times, but forever and ever, over again? Then Siddhartha knew that the game was over, that he could not play it anymore. Shivers ran over his body, inside of him, so he felt something had died. That entire day, he sat under the mango tree, thinking of his father, thinking of Govinda, thinking of Gautama. Did he have to leave them to become a Kamaswami? He still sat there when the night had fallen. When looking up he caught sight of the stars, he thought, "Here, I'm sitting under my mango tree in my pleasure garden." He smiled a little. Was it really necessary? Was it right? Was it not a foolish game that he owned a mango tree, that he owned a garden? He also put an end to this. This also died in him. He rose, bid his farewell to the mango tree, his farewell to the pleasure garden. Since he had been without food this day, he felt strong hunger, and thought of his house in the city, of his chamber and bed, of the table with the meals on it. He smiled tiredly, shook himself, and bid his farewell to these things. In the same hour of the night, Siddhartha left his garden, left the city, and never came back. For a long time, Kamaswami had people look for him, thinking that he had fallen into the hands of robbers. Kamala had no one look for him. When she was told that Siddhartha had disappeared, she was not astonished. Did she not always expect it? Was he not a samana, a man who was at home nowhere, a pilgrim? And most of all, she had felt that this last time they had been together, and she was happy, in spite of all the pain of the loss, that she had pulled him so affectionately to her heart for the last time, that she had felt one more time to be so completely possessed and penetrated by him. When she received the first news of Siddhartha's disappearance, she went to the window, where she held a rare singing bird captive in a golden cage. She opened the door of the cage, took the bird out, and let it fly. For a moment, a long time, she then gazed after it, the flying bird. From this day on, she received no more visitors and kept her house locked. But after some time, she became aware that she was pregnant from the last time she was together with Siddhartha. Siddhartha walked through the forest, was already far from the city, and knew nothing but that one thing, that there was no going back for him, that this life, as he had lived it for many years until now, was over and done away with, and that he had tasted all of it, sucked everything out of it until he was disgusted with it. Dead was the singing bird he had dreamed of. Dead was a bird in his heart. Deeply he had been entangled in samsara. He had sucked up disgust and death from all sides into his body, like a sponge sucks up water until it's full. And full he was, full of the fleeing, of being sick of it, full of misery, full of death. There was nothing left in this world which could have attracted him, given him joy, given him comfort. Passionately, he wished to know nothing about himself anymore, to have rest, to be dead. If there only was a lightning bolt to strike him dead, if there only was a tiger to devour him, if there was only was a wine, a poison which would numb his senses, bring him forgetfulness and sleep, and no awakening from that. Was there still any kind of filth he had not soiled himself with? A sin or foolish act he had not committed? A dearness of the soul he had not brought upon himself? Was it still at all possible to be alive? Was it possible to breathe in again and again, to breathe out, to feel hunger, to eat again, to sleep with a woman again? Was this cycle not exhausted and brought to a conclusion for him? Siddhartha reached the large river in the forest, the same river over which, a long time ago, when he had still been a young man and came from the town of Gautama, a ferryman had conducted him. By this river he stopped. Hesitantly he stood at the bank. Tiredness and hunger had weakened him, and whatever for should he walk on, wherever to which goal? No, there were no more goals. There was nothing left but the deep, painful yearning to shake off this whole desolate dream, to spit out the stale wine, to put an end to this miserable and shameful life. A hang bent over the bank of the river, a coconut tree. Siddhartha leaned against its trunk with its shoulders, embraced the trunk with one arm, and looked down into the green water which ran and ran onto him, looked down and found himself to be entirely filled with the wish to let go and to drown in these waters. A frightening emptiness was reflected back at him by the water, answering to the terrible emptiness in his soul. Yes, he had reached the end. There was nothing left for him, except to annihilate himself, except to smash the failure into which he had shaped his life, to throw it away before the feet of mockingly laughing gods. This was the great vomiting he had longed for, death, the smashing to bits of a form he hated. Let him be food for fishes. This dog Siddhartha, this lunatic, this depraved and rotten body, this weakened and abused soul. Let him be food for fishes and crocodiles. Let him be chopped to bits by the demons. With a distorted face, he stared into the water, saw the reflection of his face, and spit at it. In deep tiredness, he took his arm away from the trunk of the tree and turned a bit. In order to let himself fall straight down, in order to finally drown, his eyes closed, he slipped towards death. Then out of remote areas of his soul, out of past times of his now weary life, a sound stirred up. It was a word, a syllable, which he, without thinking, with a slurred voice spoke to him, the old word which is the beginning and the end of all prayers of the Brahmins, the holy Om, which roughly means that what is perfect, or the completion. And in the moment when the sound of Om touched Siddhartha's ear, his dormant spirit suddenly woke up and realized the foolishness of his actions. Siddhartha was deeply shocked. So this was how things were with him. So doomed was he. So much he had lost his way and was forsaken by all knowledge, that he had been able to seek death. That this wish of a child, had been able to grow in him, to find rest by annihilating his body. What all agony of these recent times, all sobering realization, all desperation had not brought about. This was brought on by this moment. When the Om entered his consciousness, he became aware of himself in his misery and in his error. He spoke to himself. And again he knew about Brahman, knew about the indestructibility of life, knew about all that is divine, which he had forgotten. But this was only a moment, flash. By the foot of a coconut tree, Siddhartha collapsed, struck down by tiredness, mumbling placed his head on the root of the tree and fell into a deep sleep. Deep was his sleep, and without dreams. For a long time he had not known such a deep sleep. When he woke up after many hours, he felt as if 10 years had passed. He heard the water quietly flowing, did not know where he was and who had brought him here, opened his eyes, saw with astonishment that there were trees and the sky above him. And he remembered where he was and how he got there. But it took him a long while for this, and the past seemed to him as if it had been covered by a veil, infinitely distant, infinitely far away, infinitely meaningless. He only knew that his previous life, in the first moment when he thought about it, this past life seemed to him like a very old previous incarnation, like an early pre-birth of his present self. That his previous life had been abandoned by him, that full of disgust and wretchedness he had even intended to throw his life away, but that by a river, under a coconut tree, he has come to his senses, the holy word on his lips, that he had fallen asleep and now woken up and was looking at the world as a new man. Quietly he spoke the word to himself, speaking which he had fallen asleep, and it seemed to him as if his entire long sleep had been nothing but a long meditative recitation of a thinking of a submergence and complete entering into into the nameless, the perfected. Join me. Do join me for the next video of Nirvana. Meditation, knowledge, wisdom, the story of Siddhartha. Join me for the next video of Nirvana and Siddhartha with me, Morel Bernard. Please subscribe, please share these videos. Join me for the next video. I'll see you then. Morel, bye.